بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد الحبيب. First, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Marilyn and Ethan for their kind invitation to have me speak here in the conference of Future of Olive Oil. I would also like to thank the sponsors as well, and let us not forget all those who worked behind the scenes that many of us don't know actually, but have made, hopefully will make this day today a wonderful experience for us all. So thank you so much. Today in my presentation, I will be giving you a very quick brief of Jordan, its ecosystems, and the challenges we face. Then a quick introduction to the Royal Botanic Garden of Jordan. And then I'll explain why should a botanic garden work in ecological restoration with local communities, and where I will then introduce the community-based rangeland rehabilitation program, as well as SITR, the local women's cooperative that we helped establish. And finally, I will touch upon what the Royal Botanic Garden is doing in terms of habitat restoration and ecotourism. Now, Jordan encompasses an area of approximately 90,000 square kilometers, and it is estimated to have a population of just under 10 million. Now, having said that, it's worth noting here that in the 1970s, our population was only 1.5 million. So you can imagine how much that's grown. And of the 10 million here, 2.5 are of other nationalities due to the unstable political conditions, as you well know, in our neighboring countries. So you can only imagine the impact this has had on our ecosystem services. And we most commonly define our biodiversity by four main biogeographic zones, which is the Mediterranean, Irano-Terranean, and also the Sudanian, and the Sahara Arabian. But as you can see from the map here, about 80% of Jordan is Sahara Arabian. Basically, it's a desert with less than 1% of forested area. Now, typically in the Mediterranean biogeographic zone, you would find the Aleppo pine forest like here, and where at their most southern limit in the world. So you won't get it more southern than Jordan. And it is considered as one of the world's biodiversity hotspots. They are generally found in areas of about 700 to 1,850 meters above sea level, and an annual rainfall of between 300 to 600 millimeters, and mostly in the north of Jordan. But as for the Phoenician juniper forest, it's found in the southern part and in sandy rocks. But unfortunately, and I have to say this, it is one of the most endangered habitats that we have due to climate change and the forest's very low regeneration rates, despite providing 3 ecosystem services. Second, the first is the provisioning service, and the second is the habitat service, by providing a valuable gene pool and lying in one of the world's most important migratory flyways between Europe and Africa. And furthermore, it also provides a cultural service to the local communities and through its ecotourism value. In terms of the Irano-Terranean, the biogeographic zone has the steppe ecosystem, and it's like a narrow strip that hugs the Mediterranean areas on the lower elevation, starting from 500 to 700 millimeters above sea level. And its main characteristic feature is it's treeless. It has no trees, but it has shrubs and bushes such as Anabasis syriaca and Artemisia herba alba. And the average rainfall here is about 150-300 millimeters per year. The Sudanian, now going back to our ecosystems in the Sudanian biogeographic zone, It's starting at the northern part of the Dead Sea and ends in Aqaba, which is our southernmost port. These ecosystems are fast becoming more and more popular in their cultural service as very popular tourism destinations, and actually quite a few Hollywood blockbusters were filmed there. So that's a whole new thing that's coming up. And the Sahara Arabian is the ecozone that the Hamada ecosystem is dominant, roughly constituting 50% of the area, and more commonly referred to as the Badja region in the eastern desert, which is, as I said earlier, 80% of Jordan. Now, the Hamada vegetation is characterized by its high tolerance to salinity and very hot weather, with an annual rainfall of only 50 millimeters of rainfall. So with all these different biogeographic zones, actually, and the small size of Jordan, we really do have quite a rich biodiversity in our flora, with a representation of 1% of the whole world's flora, and it has 2,531 vascular plants, belonging to 112 families and around 810 genera, of which a minimum of 400 medicinal plants, and it also has been identified, as I said earlier, as a biodiversity hotspot. Furthermore, as Jordan sits on the southern edge of the Fertile Crescent, it has been identified as the fourth most important area for food security in light of the percentage of crop wild relatives. And if you notice here, I know it's a bit small, but Cyprus is also part of that fourth most important area for crop wild relatives. However, we're facing challenges. And the challenges are numerous. But the overarching one that is exasperating us in Jordan is the impact of refugees. It has placed a great pressure on our natural resources and even on our social fabric of our society. And according to Jordan's State of the Environment's second report, Jordan has received over 1.4 million Syrian refugees within the period of 2011 and 2014. And this is only the official statistics. And we all know there is a much larger unofficial number of refugees who have also come in. So what does this translate into in terms of ecosystem services? First, it has caused an increase in overgrazing, agricultural density, logging, unsustainable collection of medicinal plants. Even in the protected areas in Jordan, there has been an increase of 300%, can you imagine, of these practices, including hunting, as well as huge sudden impacts on our natural resource, and most importantly, water. All this has strained the provisional value of these fragile ecosystems. And the second most, us as the second most water-poor country in the world, you can only imagine the impact. Now, add another effect of climate change, we can guarantee to have unbearably hot future, with an average rise in temperature in winter of about 2.5 degrees Celsius. That's on the right-hand side, by the middle of the century, and in summer by around 5 degrees Celsius. This is only if the global greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase according to the business as usual scenario. And this is where we want to try and change the model that we're adopting today. We have to change, because by the end of this century, it's expected to increase as high as 3.5 degrees in winter and 5.75 degrees in summer. Ladies and gentlemen, we do not need to wait 20 years to feel the change of climate change. This year, in Jordan at least, and I know you've mentioned it here, we have felt the effects of climate change. It is real and it is happening, but it's up to us to make the change. Now, going back to the water issue, I would like to share with you this slide as it shows us that within 20 years, and that's within our lifetime, our region will be the most stressed in terms of water, meaning we will be withdrawing over 80% more water than there will be the supply to replenish it. So if we continue business as usual, we don't have a bright future. So we have to think about that for a minute. You may think, impossible. Which decision maker would actually accept this? Well, unfortunately, it's been happening, as you can see here, and at a very alarming rate, as exhibited. But why should I speak about other countries when my very own country, and I shouldn't say this in front of the officials, but it's true, did the very same thing? I have to mention here quickly how, if you see here, Azraq is our prized oasis in the Badia region of Jordan. It is seen here in the 1950s at the end of summer, which would be its lowest water level before the winter rains set in. You can still see the abundance of water in the background, and it served as an important migratory bird stopover on the African-Eurasian flyway, and was the only permanent source of fresh water within an area well over 12,000 square kilometers. This photograph was taken more recently in 2006, showing how we mismanaged it such that it has dried up. And we had to launch a rescue project for the oasis just for conservation purposes. And it's currently only at 10% of its original state. We need to learn from each other's mistakes. So the question that arises are ecosystem services valued in Jordan? My answer to you is not nearly enough. Some studies have been conducted with the assistance of the GIZ and the IUCN. And now the Jordanian Ministry of Environment, which has only been established since 2003, is currently developing its national biodiversity policy and guidelines for the assessment and valuation of ecosystem services as a mandatory policy strategy. However, from the few studies that have been conducted, it's very clear that the rangelands, which cover 80% of Jordan, are of high value. And according to one of these studies, it's estimated that the lack of proper sustainable management costs us roughly 14 to 17 million US dollars annually. Now here comes in the role of the Royal Botanic Garden of Jordan, which I established in 2005. It's a non-profit, non-governmental entity whose main purpose is to conserve our native flora at the whole systems level for the future. Now, having only been launched in 2005, we're the very young garden, one of the youngest in the world. But it was clear from the outset that we had to work with local communities if we wanted to succeed in the flora conservation, mainly because we believe whatever we achieve in the garden site, it can be and must be replicable outside of the garden boundaries. And our aim was not only Jordan, but the region as a whole. So our components are divided into these three themes. And the science conservation, it underpins everything we do, because without facts and figures, we will never know how to move forward. And this involves all aspects of biodiversity and conservation in arid land environments. Then we need to translate the science into a language that the other audiences can actually relate and understand. And that comes in our education and community development. And we're raising awareness and disseminating the results of our research on Jordan's biodiversity to the public and to the scientific community, policymakers and other stakeholders, while encouraging nature-related projects to the local communities. And here the garden site will play an important role in this translation process, but I'll discuss that later on. Now, finally, the sustainable living theme is, in addition to the botanical components, the Royal Botanic Garden will demonstrate sites for sustainable land use, water harvesting, and practicings, because it's really different when you try and say something to someone, they won't believe you, but if they see it and they feel it and they live it, they will adopt it. And this is what we're looking for. So really, we're redefining the role of what botanic gardens should do in the future, as opposed to being those relics of the colonial era when they used to take exotic species from far-off lands and just show them off to their people. And this brings us to the GSPC, which is in line with what we're doing. It's the Global Strategy for Plant Conservation. It really has helped us in defining what activities we need to get done. Through this, we need to do, it wasn't as easy as I'm making it out to be, because we really didn't have much data. And a lot of it, we had to start from the very, very beginning and even before that. So we had to go collect data from all around the world on our plants. From that, we were able to develop the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species to help us identify which are our priority species for recovery and collection in our nurseries. And that gave rise to the first annotated checklist for Jordan, which is basically the main reference we will use for the Nagoya Protocol for Access and Benefit Sharing. And this is a very important protocol because any country that is a signatory to this protocol, they have the right to claim the benefits, and they can control the access. For example, like the halloumi cheese, it is your right, if you're a signatory and ratified it, to take a claim in either the economic benefit or even technical transfer. From that also, we did the National Flora Species Database, which would also include the cultural references, medicinal uses, not just the science aspect of that. And with that is the herbarium, our national herbarium. We're also collecting DNA material for future analysis for our gene bank. And we're the first botanic garden to have a virtual herbarium. And when I mean virtual, that anyone that goes onto the website, if you see here, is able to access any accession on the virtual herbarium and use it for research. With that, it defines our seed bank from our native flora, and we actually plant our plants from the seed bank itself, and they're all wild, accessed, sustainably accessed accessions. Now, traditional knowledge. So other than the species and everything, it has no meaning if we don't have the traditional knowledge that comes with it. And this, we had a whole project of documenting and putting down what is the traditional knowledge attached to these plants. We went to all those over than 65 to see how they use them, documented. And this also goes back to the Nagoya Protocol, because if you don't have this documented, you cannot claim anything. With that, we also took it one step further. What we did is we took the information from the local communities, and then we tested some of these plants and said, do they really have these medicinal properties or not? And some of them did, some of them didn't, but we are testing all this. Now, this goes back to the overarching concept of what the Royal Botanic Garden is trying to work with. And here I'd like to switch gears a little, because it's about the philosophy, not just the science of the work. And the first one is approaching conservation on the whole systems level by working on restoring ecosystems. And the word restoring will become more important in the future, because we want these systems to become functioning, thriving, and resilient. The second concept is including man, or rather communities, as part of these systems, because like many other parts of the world, humans have been part of nature for over 10,000 years. And it's only in the last 100 to 200 years that we abused this relationship, which rendered the ecosystems not being resilient and compromised their services. But even more important is the notion of fencing off an area for protection and not allowing people to use them. We regard that as it's not sustainable, nor is it practical, at least not in Jordan's case, because first, rural people still actually live off the land, and this is where their livelihoods depend on. So we have no choice but to sustainably manage them. Second, it also sends the message that in all other areas that lie outside of the protected area, it's okay to damage it and do whatever you want. And this is not what we're trying to promote. So what was our plan? The first step we wanted to take in this process was to restore our soils. The soil is the very essence of life, and without healthy soils, you will not get healthy ecosystems. And in order to do that, we wanted to allow it to rest for at least 3 years before we let in the grazers. And once you rehabilitate your soil, you actually can bank more water from the rainfall that you receive than if you have poor soils. And for us in our MENA region, it is so important to capture whatever little water we're receiving. And from that, you get an increase in the biomass, and from that will allow for local communities to develop the agro-businesses, inshallah. Now, we knew we had to achieve that. We would be providing food security and alleviating poverty, which is part of the SDGs, inshallah, and taking the urban to the rural to urban migration, lessening that as well. Now, theoretically, it sounded all very good, it sounded very nice, but things weren't as smooth as we had hoped. But before I tell you about our experience, I want to introduce you to our local communities. We have 3. The first of which are the owners of holiday home owners from the capital city, and you see their homes in the far picture on the mansion at the very top. And then you have the Tel Roman village community, which they live in houses and they have a school and a couple of shops. But then the last is the local pastoral community, which actually they live in tents and they're relatively nomadic. So where is the Botanic Garden? This is the Botanic Garden area. It's around 200 hectares. And it's on government-owned land that was open for uncontrolled and illegal grazing because the concept of managed grazing didn't even exist. And it was very, very highly degraded land. But after doing the countrywide study, the selection of the garden site took the highest points because there was a big, huge, big fat but, because we were faced with an ironic dilemma, whereby the herding community, who were the primary beneficiaries of the provisional service of this land for as long as time, were actually the leading cause of the habitat destruction and soil degradation. And this scenario was mirrored all around Jordan. But yet we had to help them, and we had to have them keep benefiting from this ecosystem service. And we really didn't want to alienate them at all, but rather integrate them into the formula. So as soon as we were given permission to work on the site, we fenced it up and we told the community they can't come in for 3 years, and we would give them, until we studied the carrying capacity, and then we'd give them supplemental fodder. But the local herders cut the fence. They would let the animals go and graze illegally. And we had very low vegetation, soil erosion was getting bad, and managed grazing wasn't even existent anymore. So the productivity was low. So we came up with the idea of the community-based rangeland restoration program, and it aims to maximize biodiversity by sustainably managing the rangelands by going back to our history. In the past, we used to have a system called the HEMA system, and we took elements of the HEMA system to be able to forge forward in the future. And this is something we really have to look back into our history, the way our ancestors used to use this land and manage it, to be able to learn from them and forge forward. The objectives were as follows, as you can see. They're quite a lot, but we had to identify them. And from here, when we developed the CBRR program, the most important activity we had to do was to listen to the community and to listen and to listen and to listen some more. Because for a very long time, no one has heard them. They've been marginalized from the main population of Jordan, and they do feel left out. And we had to build that trust between us and them. And we started out with 5 families who volunteered to work with us. And from there, they became our ambassadors. As a result, and you can see here, we had an increase in the pregnancy rates from the sheep from 45% at the very beginning to over 97%. And then we also, as you can see here, the biomass production increased on the site, even though the number of days of grazing per head per sheep has increased as well. So this has, and then it tapers off after the first 4 years into an increase of 10% of biomass, as well as 30% in biodiversity. So it's a win-win situation for all. So with this, we had good quality meat and good quality products. Oops, sorry. So we decided, how can we bring the marginalized community of the local herders and integrate them with the village community? So we decided to do the co-op for women. And really, the co-op for women wasn't supposed to be only for women, but it ended up being for women because women are the only ones that work. Sorry, I don't mean it this way, but it took us 2 years in trying to do this co-op, and the men would keep on fighting. Who would take the head of the co-op? Who would be the vice chair? And so on. So I decided, you know what? We don't want men. In 2 months, I'm very proud to say, the women were organized. They had already registered everything. They had already gotten all their legal papers done. And now they have a working kitchen that is approved by the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration of Jordan, and they're producing their traditional products, but on a very top quality level so far. But the intangible benefit of doing the co-op surprised me when I asked the women, because they said they finally found a network of support between them amongst themselves. They were living each one on their own in the village, holding their huge problems to themselves. When they came together through this co-op, it changed their lives. And this is what we're about, changing the lives of the future of people. So the whole process was about 7 years of rehabilitation and management training. We've had an increase of 50% of species on the site, some of which were not seen since the 1800s. And we allowed this, we haven't planted anything yet, to see the soil seed bank, what does it have? Because if you give a chance for the land to recuperate, all it needs is time and patience, and this is what we gave it, and we were surprised with the results. But the other aspect is to improve the socioeconomic status of community, because really all that anyone wants is to have a good life, and it's their sovereign right to have that. This falls in also with this, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, these targets, and the Aichi targets. Now, of the herding community, there are 52 families. That's 520 people that benefit from this program, and it comprises 100% of the herding community in Tel Rumman. And now they're the ambassadors that are going outside to other communities and promoting this system elsewhere in Jordan. Now, we can work from the bottom up, but we also have to work from the top down, meaning legislation. So we've been able to participate in the updating of the National Rangeland Strategy, the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, the new environmental law. So it's no good to start from one end. You need from both to meet in the center to be able to affect change. Now, finally, I'm going to talk about the habitat restoration, which is really at the core of things. Some people call it by many different names, but what I would like to recommend is from the Society for Ecological Restoration. They have new guidelines, and it's on the web link here. And I know this is the Arabic version, but there is other versions as well. It really gives you a process of how to change the land from something that's degraded into something that's productive. And you can measure and monitor it. So over here, this is the site of the Royal Botanic Garden, and it's divided into the habitats. These habitats, 3 will be restored because they already existed there in the past, and 2 others will be demonstrated because we want to ensure the genetic pool is still conserved. So you have the Aleppo pine forest, the deciduous oak, the riparian freshwater, the Phoenician juniper forests will be demonstrated, and the subtropical habitat. And then we're keeping other areas for research. And this is where they occur in Jordan to see the distribution as well. In doing so, we had to do studies of the sites of these habitats elsewhere to see what were the species, how was their distribution, and so on and so forth, as a reference ecosystem to what we're going to demonstrate. And these are just the different habitats. Now here we also have a different layer, and this goes back to translating the science into something people can understand, because very often scientists get together in conferences and they speak the same language and they agree and they complain about the same problems, but nothing is coming out to the general population. We need to change the minds. So through the ecotourism component of the garden, we've decided to layer it in different gardens. The first, numbers in nature. Numbers in nature really shows the majesty of God, of how things are all connected. And the one formula we're using is the golden ratio. Because if you cut a genetic DNA helix, you will see the same design as that of an Islamic geometric pattern, and it's the same principle that is in how Venus route around the earth and how it circulates around the sun. So this is something we want to show people, that everything is connected. Then you have the garden of knowledge. This is to entice the children to be able to go back to the land. Many of our children have not smelt the soil. Do you remember when you were kids, you would smell the soil, you would play in the soil? It was part of our bringing up. Today, it's all digital. It's all very clean. You know, you have to get the antimicrobial wipes so you won't get germs. We want to eliminate all that and have them jump back in, to have them plant and see how a seed can grow. Then we have the medicinal garden as well. And the Islamic garden, because this is something very close to my heart. And it also shows that the Islamic tradition in gardening is very, very rich. There's 4 different major types, which is the Andalusian, the Ottoman, the Mughals, as well as the Persian design. But this is not a static thing. It's an ongoing process, because it's the principles we want to take with us, which really is the first tradition, to my knowledge, in our area, of how to live sustainably. It says you have to be the stewards of the earth. And this message I take very strongly personally, that it is our role to be the stewards. Then you have the universe garden, which is, as I mentioned, how the planets go around each other. And the agricultural garden, what does that mean? We want to show the visitor that in the past, we had many different types of agriculture, and they were very, very successful. And to bring them through the whole history of that to the future today, and what science is doing, and I know many people are with and they're against, and it's very controversial, but GMOs. Personally, I'm against it, but we have to educate our children and the rest. Then we have the Western, Southern, and Eastern garden. But this is one thing I would like to also mention, which is part of the medicinal garden, is we want to have an olive grove and museum, because in Jordan we celebrate olives. There is not one household that doesn't have olive oil on their table. I mean, I remember when I had my children, the first thing I ever did, my mother, of course, has to be my mother, she had to wash my babies with olive oil soap. It couldn't be anything else. And then we had to massage them with a pure extra virgin olive oil, and we would not put anything else. So really, it's part of us, it's part of who we are. But at the same time, as I said, many people are losing that connection with them. So what we want to do in the museum is to have it interactive. We don't want to be sightseeing, we want to be sight doing. Get the person involved, because once you involve them, you can really build that relationship and you get them to care. And when they care, they will make the right decisions forward in the future. So the keys for success. I can't say that we're always successful. It's a dynamic learning process, but we learn from our mistakes. And we have to go through the governance approach, because it's only when you give them, the local communities, a say, and they feel they're part of that governance, would they take heed to what we're trying to do. And the socio and economic impact on the local communities, as well as the decision makers, is what can make it successful. Because really, in the life we're living today, this is the driving force of everything. And then follow up and monitoring. We have to monitor where we're going to see if we're succeeding or not. And thank you for listening.